So, going through YouTube videos, an interesting issue comes up about public schools. So, if we erase public schools, we just get rid of public schools and the whole taxation system, then people can afford private schools. Well, the idea is that private schools are superior for some fucking reason. That is far from the truth. I went to a school, I went through high school. In elementary school, we had 250 kids in the elementary school, and the high school had around 500 or something. I don't remember anymore. But, and that's just when I'm entering middle school, because we had middle school with high school. We didn't have a separate middle school, and moving in Colorado blew my mind that they have an actual separate school for middle schools. Well, we had a private school in town as well. It was a Catholic school, and it was very expensive. And basically the trade-off was you went to a school that taught you science, mechanics, physics, art, music, pretty much everything to become a cultured intellect. And we're talking multiple languages. And we were after I graduated, I went to a community college. In the community college, and they always told us this, that you're going to really look back at our school and respect it. And at the time, you don't realize, because you're in a little bubble in a small community like this, and the whole world seems like it's closing in on you, trying to weed you out. But when I went to community college, I was learning that, like, you do take it for granted, and I forgot a lot of little tiny minute things that don't matter in the real world, that the community college wanted me to pay for, which were basically fucking middle school classes. Okay, while our school essentially taught me the scientific method, which turned me into a self-taught physicist, and how I understand the universe. And so I can read PhD level papers, and I understand what the fuck they're talking about. I even know where it's going, what it's leading into, and how they all correlate to formulate the standard model. And that's just a high school education from where I came from. Now, the Catholic school, all those kids, well, we partied too. I mean, we had a lot of fun, but they were kind of screwed up. The truth is, they didn't have science. I think they had some math, but most of the time it was just religious education. That's all it was. And a lot of those kids got into drugs, and the kids at our school, some of them got into drugs too, but that's just because and though we were smaller, everybody kind of knew one another, but well, of course, everybody knew each other. Everybody knew each other's names. I've never known just pretty much everybody's names except for younger kids for the most part, but it was very rarely that you would cross somebody on one of the floors that you didn't recognize. So, in terms of eliminating public schools, fuck no. What you need to do is set capacity limits for education, classroom capacity limits, and that makes the teacher understand and know the students. If you have 10,000 students in a school, nobody knows one another, so the education becomes less, what's the word? Connecting. I don't know. If we build more schools and we place them like supermarkets, say, instead of, and like sort of like libraries. I mean, if you have more libraries, then you don't just have one library everybody's trying to go to get the same books. If you have a network of libraries, they're all cross-examining what people want to rent, and so that just they build and better one another. And if you have more public schools where they're more networked, then you can cross-examine the educations to keep them more consistent. And it's self-producing system, and a self-sustaining system that way, rather than just turning to private schools, which are absolutely fucking absurd, because then you're having these small little networks of people that don't even understand the education, what the system is producing. They're just paying in to the superiority complex that does not have an information bias. There's no education bias. There's no scientific bias. Now, at our public school, we learned about all religions. At the Catholic school, they only taught Catholicism. So people are very closed-minded. They're self-indulged. They become hypocritical. They think that the freedom afforded to them is the right to limit the freedoms of the mind and the freedom of other people. That's not a good way to govern a constitutional society. What do? Well, the only option, the third option, you don't limit public schools, and public schools are overcapacitated. There's too many people, there's too many students. They don't know one another, so the people that are diversifying, like learning an instrument, one of the most helpful things you can do is teach an instrument. And the reason is, at our school, they taught us, and we led by example too, is that the student that didn't study their instrument, didn't practice, that everybody else was being dragged down by them. Nobody wanted to be the student that couldn't play their instrument, that sounded the worst. And especially for somebody like me who was always in trouble and had no friends, I was naturally gifted, so I could play any instrument. I memorized music theory, everything. I was really good with it at that time, not music theory per se. So I have my own methods and variables that I correlate to create music. But, we got perfect scores at band competitions. It was just a bunch of farm kids, pretty much. Nobody, I mean, if you gave these people, say we went to another school, that focused more on sports, per se, they were all great at sports as well. And, we competed at recess and whatnot. But you have people from all these walks of life that learn to work together as a community, that accept each other's flaws rather than segregating one another and sticking around in their little groups and niches, or what do they call them? Cliques, right? They call them cliques or something. Who knows what they're calling it now, if that word changed. But that really functioned pretty well. Aside from how the superiority complex correlates outside of school, because then people get really domineering and controlling and trying to pretend like their successes make them more socially equitable to the foundations of the community. It's one thing or another, and there's always people who are more hypocritically domineering. As I said, the Catholics tend to do that. They think that their religion is right and they're right to govern over humanity. But in our town, we're like 7 different sections, all derived from the Lutherans. And Christianity and all that shit split up, which I don't care anymore as much. But I'm losing the mustache. So what do? The third option. Now, how do you do that and create, you just take the same taxes, but then you have to build more buildings, you have to hire more teachers, which then raises the educational standard. And you would think that educating more teachers means that their wages are going to decrease. No, that means that there's going to be more opportunity, which means that you're going to have less teachers to fill all of these schools. I mean, there are 300 million people. Let's say that there's just 1 million children alone, and you only have a capacity of 250 students per school. That's a fuck ton of schools, right? All of which need books that can cross-examine to maintain a standard of education. So that's probably the best way to do it.